food, clothing, shelter, education, transport, entertainment, hospitals, all the rest of it. Well, to imagine that that exists in the world today is, of course, quite illusory. It doesn't.
Somebody else in the front.
But does not that presuppose that you could do without the armed forces? That at the moment of the social revolution, that there would be a majority in any given area all over the world. In other words, the conditions are exactly the same everywhere. Because I can envisage a situation where the majority of the people of the world want socialism, over 70 or 80%, but there are some areas where there will be problems, where in fact you may have to call in armed forces into those borders. I mean, I don't say it's bound to happen, it could be, as you say, completely, but the actual implication of the fact that you won't need them is everything's going to be absolutely easy.
Yeah, but of course, again, you cannot answer the question.
No.
See, nobody can say at that point there just won't be any problem. I referred to a speech by Comrade Fitzgerald, and he ended with the point you made. He said maybe parts of the world where the socialists have not got control. But as I say, I'd imagine that in the course of carrying on socialist propaganda, you will have created a situation where at least the more intelligent members of the capitalist class will know that the thing's finished. But of course they're not all intelligent.
Next, yes.
During the 1880s and 1890s, the idea of free access to wealth was propagated by many unconnected groups to Anglo and North America. And why is that idea was disappeared, only accepted by the SP and a few groups of anarchists?
Well, you've got the question. It's suggested that this idea of free access sort of disappeared and has only been held by the SPGB and the anarchists. Well, it was considerably wider than this. At one time, I mean, it all rested on Marx's formulation of this proposition, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And it meant, of course, what they thought was their need, not what some outside people would tell them. Well, you see, at one time, this was subscribed to by the people who later on came to lead the Labour Party. Whether they did it genuinely or not, I mean, some of them obviously perfectly genuine, that some of them not. I mean, some of them, I think, were bowing to what they supposed was the feeling at the moment in favour of Marxian economics. But as late as 1907, when Keir Hardie was chairman of the Labour Party, he wrote a book and a pamphlet, in both of which he subscribed completely to that idea. And between the wars, when we debated with members of the Labour Party and the ILP, they would almost invariably say, of course, look, we're not arguing about socialism, we agree with you. We're only arguing about the way to get there. And if you want a simple answer to why it's disappeared, I would say that it's because Keynes came along and was accepted by everybody, all the economists, or nearly all of them, and he swept Marxism into the background. When Keynes came along between the wars, there were quite a lot of workers and various organisations studying Marxian economics and had got the idea that Marx's explanation of crisis and depression was the correct one. Keynes comes along and said, I'll save you, I'll save capitalism, you don't need to worry about them any longer, just adopt my policy, there won't be any unemployment, there won't be any crises, any depressions. It swept Marxism away, and it swept that idea away too. Although the last reference I saw to it was in a pamphlet published by the Fabian Society in the early 1960s by Professor Sargent. It's about an economic problem, and in the introduction, curiously, he recalls it all. This is 1965, I think it was. Professor Sargent said he'd been reading Morris's News from Nowhere, and he was struck by the fact of Morris saying he went into a shop to get a new pipe or something, and was told, of course, he didn't have to pay for it. And Sargent goes on to say, of course, this is the whole idea of socialism. In socialism, there won't be any paying for anything, there won't be any buying and selling. Well, as I say, that was in a Fabian pamphlet, but I'm sure if you were to put that to members of the Labour Party now, they would know what you were talking about.
Over this side first, at the very back row. Yes, with the glasses. That's it.
Yes, this comment on there's a view that's, I suppose, if not all that popular, is mouthed by many people, and even some members of the party have fallen for it. In regards to war, world war has now become an impossibility, since the enormous means of destruction are such that, you know, what is at stake that capitalist class dare not go in for, because obviously they're not going to commit suicide. And you know, the general view arising from that is that, well, it's all very well for a few people in odd countries to knock each other about, because, you know, as long as it doesn't engulf the whole world. No, comment, hardly do comment on that.
Well, you know, there is discussion about this sort of thing, but there are some things to say on both sides. Frederick Engels in the 1880s was already putting forward the view that the cost of war was too great. He mentioned battleships. He said, look, battleships cost us such an enormous amount, capitalism simply can't afford it. Well, capitalism has been able to afford a lot more than battleships and all sorts of other things since then. But there is something about it, you see, and that is this: you can probably say as a generalization that nobody, historically, nobody has ever known a ruling class that intentionally committed suicide. They don't. I mean, they make proclamations about it. The one that always occurs to my mind was at the end of the 1914 war, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany announced publicly, I am putting myself at the head of our troops and we will fight to the death. He turned up next day in Holland. And that is of course the way they behave. I mean, they don't intend to do this. And of course there comes a point where the troops won't fight, where the thing is quite hopeless. But on the other hand, you see, wars still happen, and they happen for the reason I gave, where I said, look, you've always got the situation that some younger bandits in the world may think, look, we can get away with it, right, Gautier in the Falklands. Well, what other recent wars have there been? I mean, and of course some of them are quite expensive in cost in human life and other things. So, all right, wars are enormously costly, and the capitalists don't want to do this, but the older and fatter bandits, so to speak, don't have the last word. There's always somebody who may come along. I mean, I would think myself, and I know party members, I remember Comrade McClatchy at the time of the great trouble about Cuba. You know, the supposed war was there. I think McClatchy was in America at the time, and he was saying to the Americans, look, the capitalist class are not going to destroy themselves over this business. They'll get together and they'll brush it aside, as they did. In other words, at that stage, neither Russia nor America wanted to get involved in an all-out war which would destroy them. But as I say, capitalism can put people in curious situations and put some lunatics in charge who don't feel like that. I mean, the sort of Hitler attitude, I'll go down and I'll pull the world down with me. If the capitalists let them get away with it, which of course, as far as their conscious intention is concerned, they won't.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on the previous, on the person just before this, saying that from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, has disappeared. Perhaps exactly that isn't so commonly used now, but I have heard quite a few occasions people saying to each according to their work. I think that does appear rather more often.
Yes, this is something quite different. Marx, when he said from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, meant exactly what he said, what people want to have. Theoretically, when the Communist Party in Russia got power in 1917, they had a textbook, which was the textbook of the Russian Communist Party. I've got an English translation published by the Communist Party of Great Britain. And that was full of to each according to their need. When they got into power, they altered after their first constitution, I think the 1936 constitution, they altered it. They altered it to each according to their work, which is a quite different proposition, because to each according to their work, you see, can be interpreted by them to mean the capitalism that they have got, where they can get their university experts to prove that if you pay people according to their work, you have inequality, and you can justify paying some people 10 or 20 times more than somebody else. In other words, this is justification for capitalism, and is a repudiation, entire repudiation of to each according to their need.
Somebody else, please.
On that point, I
Have
don't
you
know-
had one?
Yeah, well,
Perhaps there's somebody who hasn't yet.
I was wondering about the formation of economic groups like the EEC, whether that's likely to have an effect on the causes of war.
Formation of the European Economic Community and the causes of war. Well, of course, you've got to ask yourself what the EEC was formed for. In a world of these 160 capitalist countries, some feel themselves threatened. They get together and form alliances. I mean, like the British got together with the French and the Russians against Germany and Italy and Austria. EEC was a thing of this kind. If you cast your minds back to when the British government was thinking of going into the EEC, all the propaganda was of this kind. They were saying to the British workers and the British capitalists, get into the EEC, look, you have a great big market opened up to you. They didn't emphasise the other thing, that you get into EEC and the British market will be opened up to all these people. Macmillan met, I think he met Adenauer, but anyway, Adenauer, the German politician, was active in it, and Adenauer made a speech at that time. He said, people who think that the European Economic Community is about selling goods in a market don't know the first thing about it. What it was an arrangement by which the European countries got together to provide themselves with an industrial and military base to be able to stand up to the two superpowers, Germany and Russia. That's what it was for. There was a Tory politician at the time, I've forgotten his name, was asked about the Tory view, and he said, we understand power. If the centre is going to be Brussels, we're going to be there. That's what these groups are for. And of course, they merely enlarge the extent of the organisation on each side. They don't make any difference to it. They are, so to speak, a substitute for a special alliance like the Entente Cordiale. These people are more or less in permanent alliance, and that's what it is to stand up to the superpowers.
Right, you can have a second bite now.
Well, it was not a second bite, I'm asking for information. With regard to all these groups back in the latter part of the last century, beginning of this, who used the expression from each corner of ability, would it not be, you informed me, that many of them were in fact elitist groups, where though they use the expression because of its, because you get organisations that use all sorts of expressions which are contradictory, merely get support from different directions, and we see this problem today with the alliance. Could it not be that, or would you say no?
Well, I mean, ask yourself, you see, it came into this country through the work of from Marx,
Yeah.
through the work of Heinemann, introducing Marxian books into this country and the Social Democratic Federation. But in 1890, when the Conference of English Socialists met, and they all signed the Manifesto of the English Socialists, largely drawn up by William Morris, the people who were there were the Social Democratic Federation, the Hammersmith Socialist Society, that was William Morris, and the Fabian Society. The IOP weren't there because they were only just forming. Well, William Morris spelled it out there exactly what it meant, and you would have thought that it was completely waterproof, that anybody who signed it must have known exactly what it meant, and I think that it did. It's true that the Fabians were elitist groups, and later on they tried to rig on it. They dropped out. Sidney Webb said, well, I didn't really mean it. And Bernard Shaw said, it's all real nonsense. But it was noticeable that he didn't say it was nonsense until William Morris was dead, or he would have got a dusty answer from William Morris. But as far as the SDF was concerned, the members and of the Hammersmith Socialist Society, I would say, this was quite genuine. They knew what they were talking about. And I would say that at the time, Keir Hardie did it in 1907. You see, I mean, although his general ideas were mistaken, it was how it was going to be done, I think he was quite genuine about it. Because you can't say he did it in 1907 for some purpose of political gain, because in 1907 there wasn't that amount of Marxist influence in the Labour Party to make it worthwhile. I think he read his Marx, by the way. Various people who've written about Keir Hardie say that he didn't. He knew quite a lot about it, and he'd reached that conclusion. In other words, he said Marx is right, and he was prepared to accept it.
Cyril, I will add one point. This alteration...
Should you?
What?
Should you?
Yeah, I could tell.
Oh, well.
It was Stalin, of course,
this villain who invented it, to each according to his work, and he did it to back up the destruction of the equalisation of the final destruction of the last remnants of Lenin ideas.
Yeah.
When he said it's not Marxism, Marx said that people get different rates for different work.
Somebody else, please. Well, look, while you're thinking of it, could I just make a couple of brief announcements? One, this is an extraordinary meeting in as much you're going to have two chairmen, because unfortunately I've got to go and Comrade Davis is taking over. But the important part I wanted to mention was this. As you've probably noticed over the 5 meetings, there's lots of odd wires around, and at the back there's some sort of camera, and we've videoed, is it?
Yes.
We've videoed the whole of this series. Now, Comrade Buchanan is going to obviously look at the 5 and possibly a certain amount of editing, and we hope at the end to come up with a complete selection of videotapes dealing with Comrade Hardy's lectures. We're doing this with an eye perhaps to the American market for fairly obvious reasons, but for those of you here who may have a video machine or are interested in it, then later on I think we shall possibly through the columns of the Socialist Standard make an announcement as to what's available and what the cost is. A hell of a lot of work's gone into it, and again I'd like to thank Comrade Buchanan for coming along to all the meetings and setting up all this apparatus and doing what he has done. Now, can we have the next question or participant in discussion, which Comrade Davis will be in charge of. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I've got to go. Jory?
Right. I'm looking for someone else. You've had one just for a moment, yes. Next question? If no, there's no one else, we can come back again. One at the back there, yes?
Could Comrade Hardy give us some information on the background of the Iraq-Iranian conflict war, how the political state we had? They've been war over, they say 7 years.
Sorry, I don't get it. Only Iran and Iran. Oh, well, I'm asking about the background of the war between Iraq and Iran. If you take the Iran first, most recently, it's because
the Iran, that mad priest who's the head of the affairs in Iran, regards the Iraqis as infidels and they've got to be destroyed, but also because he particularly hates Assad, the head of the Iraq government, and is going to insist that the war will never end until they've got rid of Assad. Well, if you look back at what happened, if you look at the geographical position of the two oil-producing countries, and rather narrow seaway in between, what they're really fighting about is control of the waterway in between them. And it started with the Iraqis, I'm not sure who actually took the first move, which never matters, but the Iraqis seizing it from, or trying to seize it from Iran, and they're still fighting about it as to who controls that narrow sea passage. If you look at the map, you'll see what it is. I mean, that's what it's about.
What's on to that?
Oh, yeah, hang on a minute.
Same subject.
Yeah, and we've got several hands going up now, so...
Okay.
Comrade Robertson.
Yes, Comrade. I think it was Engels who argued, and he, by the way, was not supposed to be no mean military historian. He argued in anti-During that war under capitalism would negate itself. He put forward a good argument that way, and I was just trying to, square that with the position that there is today. I mean, I know there's been war every day since the end of the last war, but I'm talking about in the major powers. Is it possible that the ruling class of the superpowers do realise that it's suicide for them, as it is for millions of their subjects?
Yeah, well, why are you saying that Engels thought that, so to speak, they would reach a situation where they eliminated war? Because I mean, that's it, you see. The bulk of them, again using Lenin's phrase, the older and fatter bandits, would love this to happen. But see, how do they prevent a challenging newcomer coming along? Because it's always happening. It just goes that way. There was another theory put forward either by Lenin or by J. Hobson, I've forgotten which it was, that the world would reach a state in which a very few number of people had a complete monopoly over the whole world and would run everything. Well, of course, it just doesn't happen. I mean, it hasn't happened, and the competition is as fierce between all of them now as it was then. I'm afraid that this hope is just not on. See, how would you get all the governments in the world to agree? Do they ever agree, for example, at United Nations? They obviously don't. Or you've got this situation, you've now got, in one sphere, you've got three groups in the world. You've got America and NATO, you've got Russia and Comecon, and you've got another group which claims a membership of 101 nations. They were meeting a few weeks ago, who call themselves the Uncommitted Nations. And I noticed that they at the end of the conference, they issued a statement to the other powers: look, we want you to get busy and cut down armament expenditure. If you look at United Nations records, the people in the world who are increasing armament expenditure faster than anybody else are the third world, the uncommitted nations. I mean, this is the sort of thing they get. And of course, they're not uncommitted, they're all committed to capitalism.
Right.
The three main opposition parties are offering us a mixture of public works and Keynesian policies to reduce unemployment by various amounts from 2 million downward. What do you think the effect of this will be? How unsuccessful will they be? And what will be the counter effect of their policy?
Well, of course, we come back to this question as to whether governments can do anything or whatever about unemployment. If you look at the Keynesian argument as worked out by Roosevelt's government under the New Deal, you've got the government enormously increasing government expenditure, both, as they say, on capital expenditure, roads and houses and bridges and this sort of thing, and forest, looking after the environment and dredging waterways, and also ordinary day-to-day expenditure. But as fast as the government increased its expenditure, the rest of the capitalist class were reducing theirs. And this is bound to happen. It's a simple arithmetical problem. To start with this, a government cannot increase its expenditure on anything without there being a corresponding reduction of expenditure somewhere else, either by the government or by the rest of the population. I mean, it's as simple as this. It's arithmetic, and Marx dealt with it. Marx pointed it out. Marx pointed out, for example, that if the workers increase the wages of the working class, this reduces profits. So while if the wages of all workers go up, the workers buy more things of the kind of things they buy, the income of the capitalist class goes down, and they buy less of the things that they've been in the habit of buying. Joan Robinson wrote about this. She had a pamphlet called The Unemployment Problem. And she uses this argument. She said, you know, you've only got to increase the wages of the workers, it would expand the market, and then there wouldn't be any unemployment. But she's overlooked the rest of the equation, which Marx pointed out. If wages go up, profits go down. If profits go up, wages go down. You change the composition of demand, you simply don't alter it. Now, Enoch Powell was always after the Labour people and the Alliance people in the House of Commons. Every time they talk about doing something like this, Enoch Powell always gets after them and says, where are you going to get the money from, you see? And they've always been reluctant to reply, but they will give a reply. If a government decides to spend, say, another additional 1,000 million on something or other, where does the money come from? If they raise it by taxation, it's simple. The government spends 1,000 million more on something, the taxpayers spend 1,000 million less on something. It may turn out, I mean, they may spend it on different things, but it doesn't make any difference to total demand. Total demand in capitalism depends on how much the capitalist class can sell at a profit, that's all. And at the present moment it's limited in this sense that there are 3.5 million unemployed because they're not productive workers. The only productive worker under capitalism is a worker who brings profit to the employer. And these are not productive workers, so the capitalists don't employ them. The Labour Party used to use this argument, as a number of Keynesians did. They said it doesn't matter where the money comes from, whether they raise it by taxation or not, it will increase total demand. Well, in the last election, 1983, the Labour Party have woken up. They themselves say, we realise that if you raise it by taxation, it won't solve anything. Because as fast as the government raises money from the taxpayers and spends it, the taxpayers spend less, and the two things balance each other out. Then they come along with a Keynesian argument, they say, but of course it would be quite different if the government borrowed the money instead of raising it by taxation. Well, of course it won't be different. If you lend £1,000 to the government, buying some government stock or something, you can't spend the £1,000 yourself, no matter what the Labour Party says. And, I mean, the practical answer is the one that if why the government is 70 have had Labour 59 of Labour, they've been higher when they went if they rose. Or I mentioned 50 years with the American Workers' Government about its own what.
Question.
It isn't by when there was this money on advantage of it in the years Second World part there and the rate jumping up. There is an amount going on in the country which is getting the money to go to and let you want something certain. You've got to well since in Libya using by really in no who want the use. How do employ the worker anything? Barter.
I would like to point when they tax them, 80% for large point, whatever. Say, people in us portions we will tax pay on the same rate as they were, and they have the government tax. And when you say start to the look at them, they can't get the time. There are people don't investigate.
No, as much made government and they object capital on their instead of Labour. You do in the Labour muddle so. Is belief which is in play as the banks is the fundamental Marx as by Marx said.
Right now, go on.
There is a money becoming. Seems to be no because it is. It is what you countries in like becoming without oil and
because you see a power helping a power. The Arabian reports both provide reported arms. These top and some monetary from the other because so no and they try to put out the insisting and create a sort of them there. If they could they settled sometimes well that's true the response although run obviously a bit but to get down.
Is there anything to an ad opposed to different things exactly?
Well you see just interesting between wars I mean the church thing pastoral get controlized they do so they in the middle or the which was apart from in Chapter war slave I mean they said for slave to but the Francisco it's always I mean who've got it to the way the best the is in Spanish so Americans suddenly Spanish to see the American all of you look into these things of interest civil war in nation a lot of base more than and that go on to like it being the mastery but said past incubus in other on the story even college free conference went told the just second and on the thought to the back.
Question.
Oh, we've got to know this had a lot of news by that. In other words, brought them up. You remember some have been their independence thoughts that he may remember sentence it was armed civil power to trade it was 417 the ideally want the under their discipline and to politics taking them along it's been in authorities and forces happened somebody together and they create a lot of things like this but in the capitalists don't understand as after the they got position no stand without and they used to have an army now they're on from the same thing but under control as in 90% of their forces tried to this is the government of Ireland to be Ireland and the commanding army in Ireland they do it action and you might gain but put that losing it with the loser in the design about the problem out oh I see this can be on occasion happiness invented
anyone else? All feel sure you were information yes thank God very happy I hope series by already done all for coming.
the area's role.